Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us in person and via Zoom from across the country and around the world. I'd like to thank everyone who helped us to make this workshop happen, especially our panelists, Ron Mohandas Menon, Senior Officer at the International Nuremberg Principles Academy in Nuremberg, Germany, Father Yuri Shevchenko, Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Theology at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, and Professor Herbert Regenbogen, Collegiate Fellow of Law at the Catholic University of America's Institute for Policy Research and Professor of International Relations at Istanbul Kent University in Turkey. I would like to thank Professor Roman Patyr of Taras Shevchenko University in Ukraine and Professor Piotr Shvedo of the Jagiellonian University in Poland for all of their help with all three of the Nuremberg Principles workshops this spring. I'm grateful to many members of our law staff and community, especially Marketing and Communications Director Joe Ferraro, Web Design and Content Manager Al Washington, Media and Technology Services Specialist Len Davidson, Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs Megan LaBelle, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs Gemma Forrest, Assistant Registrar Natalie Pichillo, Director, Office of Institutes and Special Programs Constantia Dedulis, and the President of the International Law Students Organization, Jennifer Rodriguez. For CUA students who would like to receive an ethics credit for attending this workshop, I have circulated the link to students on a piece of paper, and it's back there, or you can come up to me and take a photo of the link, and I will try to post it onto the online chat. This is the final workshop this semester in the series of 3 workshops on the Nuremberg Principles, the fundamental principles of international law designed to protect mankind against aggressive war and establish international criminal responsibility under international law for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Today's workshop focuses on the continuing legacy of the Nuremberg Principles in an unstable and rapidly changing world. To what extent is the global rules-based order established after World War II still have relevance or meaning in a time when many states appear to be turning their backs on it or giving up on it as hopelessly broken? Are there reasons to believe in justice, peace, and accountability in a 21st century world that seems to many observers to be dangerously teetering on the brink of a third world war? And the Nuremberg Principles play a continuing role in preventing the rise of dangerous monsters like those that Antonio Gramsci feared in the 1930s when he saw a dangerous vacuum. As the then old political order was collapsing, but a new one had not yet emerged. And what is the role of conscience and faith in all this? We invite all attendees to collaborate in our discussion of these issues to the extent possible in this hybrid in-person and Zoom webinar format. Once the panelists deliver some additional remarks, we will move to discussion and you will be invited to submit questions and comments at that time. If you're participating over Zoom, please submit your questions using the chat or Q&A feature in the Zoom. We also invite you to email me to the event with thoughts and questions. My email is fisher@cua.edu. And we will continue to hold workshops in the fall semester that will explore these important issues of public international law in the context of what's sort of current events, and so those are still in the planning stages. We plan to again make those interdisciplinary in nature. So I'd like to turn the floor over now to our first panelist, who is coming to us over Zoom from Germany, Kieran Mohandas Menon. So the floor is yours, Mr. Menon.
Thank you very much. Good evening from Germany. Good afternoon to everyone there. I just want to start by thanking Professor Regenbogen and the other organizers of this workshop for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to join you. and to be able to speak on such a timely topic and in such a distinguished panel. I would like to start by revisiting two sort of distinct facets related to the Nuremberg trial, which I hope will highlight for us the importance of continually learning from history and from landmark moments such as Nuremberg. The first one is a painting by Laura Knight. It's actually titled Nuremberg. It's now in the Imperial War Museum in London. And for those of who you have not seen it, if you have not seen it, it portrays the German defendants at the dock, at the defendants' bench in courtroom 600, while the bombed out ruins of the city of Nuremberg are visible in the distance. It's a very moving and powerful juxtaposition. And I think these two realities, when we look at it, these sort of contrasting realities, they offer us some lessons for today. The first is first is a reminder of the extraordinarily difficult circumstances that the architects of the Nuremberg trial had to navigate. They had to deal not only with a city that was in ruins, but also a rules-based order that was clearly also in ruins. The second conclusion, I hope, can offer us a little more hope, because we also see that far-sighted moments like Nuremberg were, at least to some degree, able to reinvent international law, its norms, its discourse, even when multilateralism and international institutions seemed forever damaged. And I think this is particularly significant for the topic of our session today, because we are seeing similar transgressions on international law, the proliferation of international crimes, whether it is in Ukraine, in Israel, Palestine, Sudan, as well as the unlawful use of force that we're seeing in Iran and the wider Middle East. Now, the second moment from Nuremberg that I'd like to sort of focus on is the Einsatzgruppen case, which you may know was one of the subsequent trials. It was held before the US military tribunals. Benjamin Ferencz famously was the prosecutor in that case. And my Ukrainian colleagues in particular will know that one of the central crimes that the case dealt with were the massacres committed at Babyn Yar in Kiev against Jewish and other Soviet citizens during the German occupation. Now, this also included one of the largest single massacres in the history of the Holocaust, which was committed in September 1941. And as you know, in March 2022, that site of Babyn Yar was struck by Russian forces, leading to the death of 5 people and the damaging of memorial sites. And I think this attack, again, really symbolizes how history, if we leave it unaddressed and we do not learn from it, is a vicious cycle. Professor Regenbogen knows Courtroom 600 very well. And here at the Nuremberg Academy, we consider it a privilege that we have access to the Nuremberg courtroom. We almost treat it as a sort of living sacred space, because no matter what the flaws of the process was, a sense of justice was still done there. And for us to sit here and hear about how people were killed in these memorial sites of all places 8 decades after was particularly devastating. And this, of course, is continuing to occur, with the loss of human life being accompanied by the widespread damage to the environment and to cultural heritage in all of the contexts that we're discussing today. And I think this showcases why the legacies of the Nuremberg Principles are potent, and why they need to be preserved even amidst collapsing and transitioning world order. There is nothing distant or abstract about these principles. And when we look at the relevance of these legacies, I think we need to do so in a layered manner. And I would maybe highlight 3 dimensions in particular that are worth examining further, namely the norms, the language, and the framework that has emanated from the Nuremberg trial. Now, Winston Churchill famously remarked during the Second World War that we were in the presence of a crime with no name. And to some degree, I think Nuremberg's achievements responded to that problem with the codification of the crime of aggression, of crimes against humanity, and its omissions. For those who know the legal history, you will know that it was the trial's omissions to some degree catalyzed the creation of the Genocide Commission. These are important norms that are now under exceptional strain. However, in domestic jurisdictions, and I think we far too often overlook domestic jurisdictions when we speak about the history of international criminal law, they do still continue to help accountability efforts. So in Europe, for example, last week, you might have seen the first conviction of a French member of the Islamic State for genocide and crimes against humanity committed against the Yazidi Committee. A similar judgment was also held in a German court a couple of years ago. And a few months ago, you might have noticed the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia convicted 12 former military officers for their involvement in what is called 135, for their involvement in 135, what is called false positive deaths, which is killing civilians and then falsely reporting them as rebel fighters. Ukraine, as we know, has been taking a leading role in clarifying how the crime of aggression can potentially be prosecuted, whether it's within a domestic system or through the creation of a special tribunal for this purpose. So I think it's important that we do not lose sight of supporting domestic systems when we talk about the international law order being in crisis, as strengthening them will certainly help further the implementation of the Nuremberg Principles. And how can we do this? Well, innovation will certainly be necessary. What we've seen with the experience here in Germany is that when there are specialized units for the prosecution of international crimes within national prosecutorial and investigative agencies, this definitely helps because that way, if we have perpetrators crossing borders, the state is better prepared to apprehend them. And also, for those of you who may not know, the Jesuits case, for example, that was held in 2020 in Spain, where an El Salvadoran colonel was convicted for his role in the murder of 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador in November 1989, you see that domestic jurisdictions can sometimes look backward and identify historic impunity gaps, even when international courts and tribunals are unable to do so for reasons of jurisdiction, resources, or otherwise. Now, the second facet I'd like to focus on is the language of Nuremberg. And I think this language, to a large degree, can serve both as a moral framework, but also as an aspiration, perhaps, in relation to how the behavior of states and individuals are to be regulated. Now, Justice Jackson, the chief prosecutor from the US here at Nuremberg, in his iconic opening statement noted, and I quote, "The refuge of the defendants can only be their hope that international law will lag so far behind the moral sense of mankind that conduct which is a crime in a moral sense must be regarded as innocence in law." He continued on to emphasize that the trial was challenging that proposition. And Hirsch Lauterpacht, another one of the main architects of the Nuremberg trial, who also was crucial in consolidating the doctrine of crimes against humanity, endorsed this view by stating that the Nuremberg Principles have transcended the occasion that gave rise to them. In other words, they now have a universal significance. And I think this is where we need to do some introspection, because it is no secret that international criminal law has a selectivity problem. Sometimes this selectivity has been due to externally induced constraints. Other times it has been self-inflicted. But the truth is that we are often selective in what we choose to platform or condemn. And I think this reality is continuing to insidiously weaken the international order from within. And when we talk about restoring or reinventing this order, I don't think it can be done unless we really challenge and confront the selectivity issue. Now, the framework that emanated from Nuremberg is perhaps the aspect of this legacy that is most under threat. There's the paralysis of the UN Security Council. There's the withdrawal of funding that we see from multilateral institutions. And this has been accompanied by the rise of asymmetrical warfare, the rapid expansion of technology. And when we talk about moments like artificial intelligence becoming perhaps unregulated to a degree that is dangerous, I think, again, here we see the importance of furthering historic education, because you see that revisionism and disinformation, including in relation to totalitarian past, are now being amplified among young people by artificial intelligence and apps using this form. So that is an issue that, again, I think shows us the importance of looking back. Now, the framework that I mentioned, while under threat, perhaps still offers some hope. You still see cases such as with the situation in Sudan and the Philippines progressing in the ICC. With Syria, for example, the international independent and impartial mechanism, which is established by the UN to preserve evidence, has suddenly become extremely relevant when in the post-Assad era. And here I would like to quote Natia Navruzov, who directs an NGO called YASTA, when she says the most important need, especially in terms of support for survivor communities, is the preservation of evidence, even when the immediate prosecutions or the usage of that evidence seem unlikely. Now, before I conclude, Gary Simpson, who some of you might have read in your international law sessions, has described the international legal order as a product of the interaction between three languages. He calls them the language of sovereign equality, of great power dynamics, and the language of anti-pluralism. Now, we are at a moment where, admittedly, the order is in significant crisis. But we're also seeing a paradox where an exceptional number of states, for example, are engaging with the International Court of Justice. So perhaps this shows us that states somehow still see international law as a framework to challenge these great power dynamics. It still seems to offer them some meaning, even in uncertain times. Now, I will not focus on that dimension as it will be covered by my distinguished co-panelists, but I would instead like to conclude by once again quoting Justice Jackson, if you indulge me. And this is also from the opening statement where he says, while this law is first applied against German aggressors, if it is to serve a useful purpose, the law must condemn aggression by any other nation, including those which sit here now in judgment, referring to, of course, the organizers of the trial. And I think whether we are able to do so evenly, consistently, and persistently will largely determine the place of the Nuremberg Principles in what is a changing world order. And I hope we will be able to do that. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Father Suchenko.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm a member of scholar which, due to the scale invasion, has to do this with justice. Just for this is why I'm sitting here. I am not moral theologian, I am not lawyer, as you may see. But since I was invited to talk, I would like to share with you some of my thoughts on basic functions of legal order, theological perspective of international law in a time of crisis. We gather here at the moment when the international order established after 1945 is under profound stress or even threat. Wars rage in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, powerful states activists increasing disregard for the rulers and institutions that have maintained substantial peace for nearly 80 years. And the way this story moves forward, we ask the oldest jurisprudential question: does international law actually exist for us? If it still exists? And if it does, what gives it binding force and there is no external authority control? As it is the evolution of Ukraine, from Kyiv, from a country that has been living under scale military aggression since February 24, 2022. I say this not to make a political claim, but because the question we have posed about confidence based as a little corner is not an abstract for me. It is the air I breathe. Let me offer three interlocking arguments. First one, I am not sure that you haven't seen all letters, but he uses the term synesis. I'll explain. So, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, born in 1948, opens with the claims it deserves more attention than it usually receives. Article 1 states that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act over one another in the spirit of brotherhood. The word conscience in the legal text is not accidental and it is not neutral. It carries a long theological genealogy. The Greek term synesis, conscience, appear with particular depth in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. Paul describes Gentiles who do not possess the Mosaic law, yet who nonetheless do by nature what the law requires. He says, when Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, then a law to themselves even so they do not have the law. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their inflicting thoughts accuse or house excuse them. Their conscience bears witness, their thoughts accuse them of defending them before an inner tribunal. This is the theological precise description of exactly what the skeptics of international law say is impossible. A moral obligation that operates without external enforcement is genuinely binding. All is described in universal moral consciousness. One across ethical and cultural boundaries, grounded not in human convention, but in the structure of the human person, as a creation made in relation to God and after the image of God. This idea, so presented in the New Testament, would find its fullest elaboration in the centuries that follow. Through Thomas Aquinas, through Victorius, Suarez, and Grotius, this theological concept of conscience migrated into the very foundation of international law. Grotius argued that the natural law would bind ever if God did not exist. Still, his entire framework depended on a thoroughly theological moral anthropology. But the drafts of the Universal Revelation in Gaza in 1947 and next year they were drawing on this long stream. The declaration was born from the collective outrage, that outrage of humanity confronted with the Holocaust. That outrage was not a legal category, it was both moral and theological. It was a conscience, the conscience of humanity speaking in the face of radical evil. The insight I draw from this is simple but consequential. International law, at its deepest level, does not rest on enforcement mechanism, but it rests on conscience. And conscience, or reason, is a body and scholastic condition, is not a cultural construct. It is written into the human person. This is why international law exists even when it is violated. And law that is broken is still a law. Conscience that is suppressed is still conscience. Second point, justice as a paradigm of 1945. When we ask what kind of legal order was established in 1945, we often instinctively reach for just war theory, which has shaped the legal language of armed conflict for centuries. But I want to propose that the documents of 1945 and 1948 represent something theologically different. The United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration are not primarily just war documents and just history documents. The war theory asks a primitive question under what condition it is voted to kill. It begins with the assumption of complete and seeks to regulate. Justice theology asks a constructive question. What does a genuinely just and sustainable peace look like, and how do we build it? It begins with peace as a positive moral good, not merely the absence of war. Theological roots of this peace draw from the Hebrew concept shalom, not merely the cessation of hostilities, but a condition of goodness, just and right relationship. It means to be perfect, to feel content, etc. It draws on the Sermon on the Mount and on the Holy vision of reconciliation as the central work of the gospel. The United Nations Charter declares its people determined to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war. And when the Universal Declaration asserts the equal dignity of every human being as a foundation of international order, they wrestle consciously or not given legal form to this vision of law. Here, I want to make a favor. One, the Synod of Ukraine, Synod of Bishop of Ukraine Catholic Church and the Lord Church, named with a great precision in their 2024 message on war and peace is a context of new ideologies. You may find it on the internet translated into 7 languages. And it's the only document which appeared in Catholic Church, which explains what's all about when it goes about this war, which are started in Ukraine. The big mistake after the collapse of the communist bloc, they write, was that post-Soviet Russia was not required to condemn the crimes of the communist period and to undergo dehumanization. Nothing similar to what happened in Germany after Nuremberg was done in Russia. The democratic world holds the economic ties to build trust and sustainable peace. Instead, the Kremlin used the situation to accumulate resources for rounds of war. The Ukrainians then were somewhere knowledge. He was president under the Brezhnev regime, a man who spent years in Soviet labor camps. He is bisexual. He was bisexual. The university working. Has long repeated warnings that constantly unpunished evil does not simply disappear by itself. So this is not merely a political observation. It is a theological one, affirmed by the scripture itself, which we find in the book of Ecclesiastes. Because the sadness against evil is not prostituted, the reports, the hearts of men, filled with the desire to commit evil, writes Ecclesiastes. The synodal message makes this argument direct. The international community did not develop adequate mechanisms for identifying and responding to the possible repetition of the tragedies of the 20th century. This also the dangers that Prophet Jeremiah identified. They have healed the wound of my people, likely saying, peace, peace, but there is no peace. Ukrainian Catholics, Bishop, message cites this word directly because it describes exactly what we hear today. Calls for compromise, dialogue, even appeasement, that in practice demand from the victim a surrender of dignity and existence. And justice cannot be the appeasement of an aggressor, not the recognition of occupied territories. As the message states, it must restore the principle of international law and include truth, accountability, and conciliation, etc. I immersed myself for the last 4 years in what we call justice. And I taught the course of justice in Notre Dame spring semester last year. And what I discovered is that most people do not realize that justice is a reflection of God's order. It's not minimal peace, formal peace, peaceful, or whatever. It influences God's order. As a biblical scholar, when I look at the word tzedakah, which you translate justice or vindicate sin or whatever is meaning for the star for you, I always think about the order. It can be diminished, marketed, or changed. But we propose today solutions which will bring more pain in the future. And the third point, Ukraine is a test case when conscience is captured. Russia's war against Ukraine is not only a violation of international law, it's also a theological problem of the first order. The Russian aggression has been accompanied from the beginning by elaborate theological justification. What I mean, the ideology of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, presents Russia as sacred civilization with a divine mission. You see how it resonates with other literal claims. The Russian Orthodox Church under Patriarch Kirill has provided explicit theological cover for the word blessing, truths, and framing the conflict as a spiritual struggle. The 25th World Russian People's Council has even declared this war a sacred war in the name of Holy Rus. This is a case study in what happens when the logic of empire captures a religious tradition. Already mentioned in the synodal message, in a paragraph 12 describes this with precision. Orthodoxy in this Moscow form is being used to fill the ideological vacuum left by the fall of communism, treating religion as a means of reinforcing state power. Church, simply saying, became an ideological department of totalitarian regime. The Patriarch of Moscow has a centuries-long tradition of serving the Russian government in its various historical forms. What is new is the result. A quasi-religious ideology that sanctions the destruction of the entire nation. A group of nearly 350 Orthodox theologians from around the world condemned the Russian world doctrine as a heresy, instinctively reaching for just war theory. Use ad bellum, use in bellum, which is a violent doctrine that has no justification, they say. They're right. But this condemnation, however correct, has not stopped the bombs. And the synodal method poses a crucial diagnostic question in this war. The very language of spiritual values is threatened as Russia and other authoritarian regimes use this language to persuade people's hearts to commit terrible sin. This is the deepest form of moral corruption, not the denial of conscience, but its capture, its distortion into a tool for evil. Many of the documents of the Russian world ideology alongside the New Testament, what strikes me most is the inversion of the Johannine tradition. Johannine means Gospel of John, his letter, Revelation, is what I teach people. Normally, the Apostle John calls us to test the spirits on two criteria: moral, keeping the commandments, and doctrinal, right teaching about Jesus. It means when we are Christian, what we declare we live. If not, we are not Christian. It's just just masquerade. A church that blesses genocide fails to possess. As John writes, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. In the language of the Old Testament prophets, Russian Orthodox Church speaks with the voice of false prophets. Those prophets of Baal required doing sacrifice to sustain their legitimacy. The synodal message also calls attention to the broader failure of international conscience. When the international community fails to condemn and oppose aggression properly, it creates the illusion that violence is a legitimate model of international relations. The blind law of the strong replaces the force of international law. This is very similar to the international climate before the outbreak of World War II, as visuals know. The aggressor again feels impunity and placed on this figure. And yet, this is a crucial theological point. Conscience has not been declared the sentence. It has spoken elsewhere. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin in March 2023. That legal act has no enforcement mechanism. Russia will not extradite him, but the warrant exists. It names what happened. It bears witness. This is precisely the prophetic function of the law at its limits, speaking truth to power without the power to compel. The biblical prophets, Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, operate in exactly this mode. They have no armies, no enforcement mechanism, no institutional power to compel kings and nations. What they had was the word of truth, spoken in the name of the justice that transcends political power. And that word proved in the long run more durable than the empires it confronted. The Ukrainian Catholic Church synodal message articulates this with a voice from our own Kievan tradition, the millennial slogan of Prince Vladimir Monomakh, in our Duke who lived 1,000 years ago. Do not let the powerful destroy a man. Is a Kievan church called to the conscience of the modern law. It is not an utopia. It is a prophetic claim. The conscience grounded in the image of God in every human person cannot automatically be suppressed. And concluding, the world order established in 1945 is under severe strain. But I do not think it's finished because the promise from which it drew its authority is not finished. The synodal message of the Catholic Church warns that modern humanity, the humanity of the post-truth era, does not recognize objective truth, it will gradually become a post-justice world. In such a world, law is replaced by interest, the right of the strong prevails over the rule of law, and the foundation of international order are subverted by geopolitical power. We are watching this happen in real time. But theology offers something that political analysis cannot, a deeper account of why the law matters even when it cannot be enforced where human dignity is not negotiable, when even when the powerful treat it as such, while the work of building just peace alone remains a genuine human vocation even in the darkness of times. To return to where we began, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration says that human beings are endowed with reason and conscience. Not reason alone, not power. Conscience, the inner witness that the Apostle Paul says speaks still in those who have no external law. The conscience is what gives international law its moral authority. And that conscience, in the end, is what holds the powerful accountable, even when no court can reach them yet. The conscience of humanity is speaking. From Bucha, from Mariupol, it's our Ukrainian city which were destroyed by Russian invasion, from the testimonies of survivors, from the world, the international criminal court. The question today is whether we, in our institutions, our universities, our laws, our moral commitments will listen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Father. Our third panelist today will be Professor Reagan Bogan. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'm very privileged to be here with you today, and I want to thank everyone for having the time and interest joining us today. I think the most important conclusions from these three workshops is based upon the art of destruction. And when we speak of destruction, what does that really mean? Is there really something called just war? That's the opposite of a just peace. And war is destructive. So where is justice? It's an interpretation of those who are victims of injustice. But in the 21st century, where total war is annihilation, total destruction, there's no word for justice, only that destruction is evil. And that's the end. So that's a reinterpretation of the Middle Ages of just and unjust war. And that is something for the future, when we are trying to reestablish the norms, the dignity, and the legitimacy of what has occurred in the last 12 months. For we have voted in an administration that is set out for disruption. This is not a crisis like the Great Depression of the middle of the interwar years. This is inflicted consciously because there is an assumption that the liberal world order conflicts with the mores of a conservative understanding of legitimacy, of people's individual conscience. And that goes through domestic laws, from abortions, or from other issues of that nature. And people of faith can choose. And those who don't have that faith have also, in terms of being tolerated, because that's what it's all about, is tolerance. Accepting others for what they are. That doesn't mean that you have to stop discussing it. That's the purpose of openness and a university, is taking the challenges. This is not a home. This is a place to have not fear, but the openness to discuss issues. And these issues are here in this workshop, the most important part, because when we compare what we are looking at in terms of destruction, Ukraine, Tehran or Iran, Gaza, Israel, Yemen, and so forth and so on. This is now what has happened. And to consciously understand that, that means every individual who's in this room or who's listening or who may listen on the YouTube of what is being discussed, it is the accountability of every individual. And if you live in a democracy, you have a privilege. Unlike living in a country like China, where again, our very prominent colleague of ours at the law school is retired, Professor Robert Destro, who was the acting Secretary of State under the first term of President Trump, brought up the issue about harvesting organs Can you imagine that people who are dissidents in China are being collected, examined, so they can become a commodity? So when a recipient says, I have the money, I need your organ, including your heart, well, you know the result of that moral discussion. And yet we, in our US-China relations, have not brought that up to really what needs to be done. And why? What are the interests? And these are the questions about the hypocrisy of what has led to this kind of unlawfulness that we are facing today, because we've discounted the moralities that we have tried to sustain over 80 years. And young people, like yourself, are skeptical. And they're not really coming on board and saying, well, we need to do this. But the reasons are that there are important reasons. It's about the consciousness. But it's not so much about consciousness than the nature of humankind. In the Middle Ages, or even in ancient times, it spoke of the nature of man. Well, we've changed a little bit about that. We've expanded it to women also. So that's the reference to humankind. And language matters. Kind of words we choose matter tremendously. And when leaders don't respect that, it becomes a derogatory that, again, is sublime and becomes a part of our understanding or our impertinence to this kind of language, communication, respect for the other. And this is what it's about. It's about taking groups and discriminating them, using them as an scapegoat. This was used in Germany in World War II. This is used in China for the Uyghurs. And it goes on and on and on. And our most important issue is, don't we have to look abroad, look at ourselves right here in America? For that's really the question that we have to ask in our consciousness and in the nature of a human being. And it's this nature that makes me wonder, what is it all about? When we look at all what is happening on the streets of our country. So it comes back to how we can reconstitute our understanding of respecting others for their opinions and values. And again, to become not polarized, but becoming a family of brothers and sisters, or people who really are not scared to engage with one another for a very important rule, a rule of law, a rule of accepting others, and to live together in what we are really striving for is peace. Now, there are issues with states. And in the interwar years, as the Marxist Gramsci described, there are monsters in the room. Well, those monsters were, in retrospect, we look at as in terms of Mussolini, and Hitler in Germany, and Stalin in Russia. And as my colleague here to the left described, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, there was no proceedings to seek out those criminals for war crimes or any kind of crime. So this was, again, realpolitik. And that's what we have. We have in the US-China relations, realpolitik. We don't look at the undercurrent of issues. And again, all of this molds to the question, how do we restore a world order? Will it be might makes right, as in the 19th century, where the Bryan-Kellogg Pact of 1928, and again in interwar years, where there's a great amount of chaos due to the Great Depression. This was not self-inflicted, this occurred. And because of crisis, we have to understand what kind of crisis. Is this a crisis like COVID? That's something beyond our own conception, our own ability to cope with. And luckily, we found the science and the technology to prevent this crisis from overcoming us as a people. But others will come. So we need to be better prepared to understand what we need to do as an individual in terms of our nature, in terms of our critical thinking. And this is the essence of why we're here, critical thinking. Because we're not just talking about Christianity. We're not just talking about Mosaic laws of shalom, peace. We're talking about a whole universe of different understandings. But this is culture. These are traditions. And that is the fruitfulness of what we have to appreciate and can appreciate. But to do that, the question is, how do we restore law? How do we bring countries that are disrupted, that have gone to war without legitimacy? And the question of what is on my agenda today is, how do we bring us together to respect and to really cultivate a world order that is not filled with hypocrisy? What do I mean? I mean, one country condemns that you go to war, called crime of aggression, example, Russia. And now you have another country that violates the sovereignty of another country and says this is a threat, Venezuela. When you look at, again, boats, people in the Caribbean Sea who are now already not to be able to do anything except to survive, but they're considered non-combatants. At least that's the rationale from the Secretary of War. And then you have a death. And this is, again, a convention that people say, well, okay, it's a non-combatant, it's legitimized. Really? I mean, if you look in the 1940s, when you have partisans fighting in France against the Germans, they were considered by Carl Schmitt. Yes, Carl Schmitt is a part of the legal doctrines that you are learning about. And they are being practiced, interpreted. That's where it comes from. And that was then interpreted as saying, well, these are partisans, they're non-combatants. And now they have no rights, we'll kill them. So again, the question is, what is the dignity of a human? By just classifying them as one category and giving legitimacy, and now I feel I can go home? Or is there something that you need to look through, analyze? And that comes back to this nature of humankind. So my entire idea or the presentation that I'd like to conclude with is that whatever we do, it is us each day that we work together, whatever that might be, and we reach out to others here in this community as well as around the world, because internet allows us to do that. We can engage. Engagement is really what John F. Kennedy was talking about. Don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Maybe we should recall those words again and bring us back into an understanding how important it is that what we do as individuals does have a purpose and a merit. Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's time we can take questions that you may have, thoughts that you may have about what has been said, or about other issues relating to what has been said. For those who are on the Zoom, if you could post any questions that you have on the online chat. Anyone, any thoughts? Yes, and if you wouldn't mind, due to the microphones in this room, you could just walk down here and speak to the panelists so that your voice is picked up for those on Zoom.
First off, thank you, all three of you, for speaking to us.
Maybe a little bit further forward. I'm so sorry, the microphone is down here.
Is this better?
I think so.
So first off, thank you, all of you. My name is Nico. I kind of have two questions that I'll try and combine into one. It's for both Father and professors. So Father, you mentioned Paul's letter to the Romans as a way to, as maybe an influence for the documents and how we should look at the world today. But Paul, specifically in terms of conscience and having, like even non-Christians would have the law of God written on their hearts. It seems to me that Paul kind of assumes that that law is the law accepted by Christians, but I'm not sure that the UN or international law accepts that. And so how should we in the modern world and this kind of is where it links into what the Professor was saying, where you mentioned we need to tolerate all different viewpoints and have an open discussion. But if the law that at least Paul talks about is written on every human heart is one that would be taught through the Gospels, but we don't commonly accept that, how should we go about engaging in international law in a way that is tolerant and open to these discussions, but recognizing truth nonetheless? I don't know if that makes sense. It's clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. It seems to me that to answer it, I have to give another lecture. You know, what was the reason the organizing countries in European Union? You know who were the founders of European Union? It were devoted Christians. And you know also what is what we call human values. For me, it's a Christian values without Christ applied to the different sphere of societies alive. You know also about the problem when modern world, what I always say, failed in post-modern world. Because during the modern world, people suppose that they may do everything, but after two worlds war, after Holocaust, different genocides, some philosophers said that we are not responsible for our act, because they were shocked how German national philosophers, scientists could develop that idea of concentration camps and other things so strongly that it eliminated millions of people. So they said that the person is not responsible for his action. It's a person can be described as a stream of changing emotions. Everyone has its own rule. You have such, I have this, or another one. It means that philosophy of how to say that there is no truth. You know, everyone has its own truth. Prevailed. And then postmodern world developed in what we call postmodern world, where anxiety covered everything, because you were not sure about tomorrow, what that or other leader will do. So you have to be always alert, because you never know what may happen. I mentioned these things. If there is no truth, there is no evil as far as this world. After World War II, people were afraid of such a cruelty that they said there is no evil. Evil is a lack of goodness. But when there is no evil, there is no moral responsibility. But what I mentioned at the beginning of my talk is that people who wrote that Human Rights Declaration were inspired by all this, what we call biblical values, even they were not precisely mentioned. I would suggest you just to pay attention to one small book. You may read it in one evening, Evil and the Justice of God. It's written by Anglican theologian. I suppose he is one of the best biblical scholars of our times. He was former Bishop of Durham, but he's a good scholar. He wrote over 80 books. He has popular books and academic books. He's historian of the early church and New Testament scholar. He influenced you very much, and I read most of his books. And his books, Evil is the Justice of God, he says that If we do not realize the existence of evil, we are very naive unless it pushes us in the face and we react not adequately. Law has something in a Christian thinking. That law, what appeared, starting from law of Moses and others, it has Christian roots. We can call it human values or whatever. But if we do not recognize this, then we live like in jungle without no rules. And the problem of our times is that we are not able to understand the level of the threat we face. 3 weeks before the full-scale invasion started, I was asked, is war possible? I said no. Because I couldn't believe it's possible in the 21st century. I was asked by different people. I was told by my colleague with historian Yaroslav Resak that in a month we'll have a war. Because he had a meeting with the Secret Services and military representatives. They had a close meeting. He said, Yuri, we'll have a war in a month. I said, you're too pessimistic. 2 of my friends, they were at the front line and had said, in a month we'll have a war. I said, guys, it's impossible. How you can imagine this? Why I couldn't accept this? Because of it's a surrealistic reality. It's illogical. But evil is always illogical. And what I see for the last 4 years is people on the West are not able to understand the level of the threat we are facing right now. We are in a phase when we observe destroying of the world's order, which was established after World War II. But the Declaration of Human Rights, I'm convinced, and all what we built after in the last 80 years has Christian roots. You may call it human values or whatever. It doesn't matter. I never insist on it. But even, I'm open-minded person. I believe that what we call gospel values, Christian values, they correlate with different religions, and they have much in common. If it's not fundamentalist, it's not, unless it's not fundamentalist representatives, you will find very much in common. So, that's my answer. That evil exists and truth exists, and truth exists. We have to just realize this because of your lawyers. My son, I'm an Eastern Catholic, so I'm lawfully married on you. I always have to remember for Roman Catholics, some Catholics of Byzantine tradition can be married. So I'm a proud father of 5 kids. My oldest son, he specialized in criminal process. It's strange for my mind, but he talks sometimes and explains me a lot of things. Because and he understands if there is no law, if there is no conscience, if there is no what we call the basis for the law is chaos. The world then is in chaos. We return into Middle Ages, and we are about to return when we will not understand that this has some basics which are inserted in our humans. Sorry for long answer.
Let me take it from another point. So you have values and you have principles. And the Nuremberg legacy is about principles. And when we have commandments, which is a part of Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, you have, again, principles. Now, there are conditions where you say, well, under circumstances, this changes. But again, your principles are not to change. So you may be found guilty in a law, but there is consideration as to your punishment, because there are conditions for breaking the principle. And therefore, we have realpolitik in international relations. So the question is, how do you bring morals, ethics, not the same. Values is not the same as principles. They're very different. But this is the dilemma of a judge, because he has to rule according to the statute law, or he has to rule according to an international convention, a war crime. And therefore, there are circumstances. But in the 21st century, there is no circumstances for destruction, period. You may say, well, it was a threat, and it was this, and it may be another condition, but you're telling about killing. This is not war crimes, this is a crime of war. Completely different, and jurisprudence has not attracted or have begun to really look at this question until just very recently. And that's why crimes of humanity are now being discussed as a law after many, many years, and should be in its first phase in the UN this year. So again, definitions of like the crime of aggression took many decades. And only in the La Pola agreement or treaty was the definition agreed upon. Now the implementation. And for that in Ukraine, a special court was created in The Hague, specifically through the European Council and the Ukraine to prosecute Russian alleged criminals of Russia in that court, under that jurisdiction. But again, it's all about legitimacy. And again, the point of all what we're discussing is that if you're listening to others, and this was the point, you give up on your understanding, your reasoning, your faith in the principles that you believe in when you are talking to a barbarian, which you need to because it's realpolitik. I mean, Putin is a barbarian when you look at the war in Ukraine, but he has immunity, and this is realpolitik. This is the kind of world we have created. This is our human nature. This is not God's will. It is the will of the human nature of humankind. And if we want to change this, then we are accountable. Each individual is accountable to make sure that those norms are not being just rationalized. And accountability is the essence of the International Criminal Court, which has been, again, discounted as the moral institution for what is going on today. And if there is an internal report which has been generated to investigate immorality in that court, well, that has been done, and it's been concluded in December of last year. And yet we're still waiting for the result, and nobody talks about it. So again, things are being camouflaged because nobody really wants to address them. And that's the point of being at a university, to uncover that which is not being discussed, to go after the unknown, to look at humanity in the framework of what we are doing with what we created. And with the creation of what we believe in and what we have created, we should try to bring more harmony into our daily lives, so we don't have what we call paradoxes. So it's a challenge. And again, if we're going to find peace and security, we've got to do a better job, because the only way you're going to have peace and security is through justice. And that's a hard word to fulfill, because that's where we're shortcoming.
This is a question from one of this law school's public international law students. And I think I would direct it first to Mr. Menon. If you can hear me, Mr. Menon. Question is, states with the most power generally tend to get away with committing crimes against peace. What concrete institutional or legal mechanisms are most likely to be effective at challenging unlawful actions of these large countries? That most members of the international community often find themselves picking and choosing their battles. And I think you also might address perhaps the perspective of the global south countries in this.
Thank you for the question. I think I got most of it. I'm sorry if there's a lag, but I can try and answer this actually in a way that is a continuation of what my distinguished co-panelists were saying about the earlier question, which is that it is very true that the systems we've created are kind of skewed, and that time and again we see that power dynamics do in fact make the system uneven or unjust and so on. But I think we should also stop seeing international law purely through the prism of states. We should start seeing it also from the perspective of individuals. And that was the primary shift that we saw in Nuremberg. And here, the reason I wanted to come back to the previous question is, I think the one value that I've seen all through the work we've done here at the Nuremberg Academy with survivor communities more than any is the value of compassion. When you deal with survivors, they don't want vengeance, they don't want retribution, they want a sense of justice. And that's why they engage with international law, because they see it ultimately as a system that aims to create a reality where you treat each other the way you want to be treated yourself. And when you look at how powerful forces have been taken on, and I can give you examples, for example, what we saw in Argentina with the military dictatorships brought down, it was always through supporting civil society. It's as Professor Regenbogen said, supporting civil society in those states themselves and not hiding behind realpolitik and trade-offs and the markets to try and get through the easy way. So yeah, I mean, the current system definitely is, as you say, flawed, but I do think there are, and the Crimes Against Humanity Convention that's coming, for example, the fact that the International Court of Justice is getting so much attention, example, I think there's still enough hope for us to be able to recalibrate if we could maybe try and support civil society and survivor communities in these in places rather than just purely looking at it through the prism of the state. I know that might not be a satisfactory answer, but these are tough times, and I think we need to start somewhere.
Thank you. Would either of the other panelists like to respond also? Yes, Father.
I may just say thank you for this.
Maybe the only, look, it's pretty simple, and yet it's very, very complex. Simplicity is the point of a beauty, but behind that beauty stands a lot of meaning. So as they say, a picture is worth 10,000 words. And it's very simple principles. We know what we need to do. Now we need to get out there and do it. That's the hard part, because we always have reasons of not wanting to get up and read. We don't like reading. Sort of a problem. Being assigned every week 175 pages. And somebody says, oh, what? Oh, look, it's that kind of reality. And it's time that we understand that we are facing really challenging moments. And I'm not talking about ensued crisis. I'm talking about existential crisis. And if we don't believe ecology or what is happening in the environment, then we are blind to reality. And this is going on in our political decisions in this country. And there may be reasons and arguments, but again, there's only silence. And in that silence, there's an old statement. First they came for this group, Then they came for another, and then another. Finally, they came for me. And that was a quote from a priest or a pastor in World War II. And so it's really a question of conscience and looking at the lessons of history. And history is an important subject for any decision. So I think that should be my attitude to the answer.
So I'm wondering if one thing that you could tell some of the students here, Mr. Manon, are what opportunities are there for young legal professionals to get involved with the work of the Nuremberg Academy?
I think this one's an easier question to answer, maybe. Well, the first thing I would say is if you're interested, well, we do offer internships for young professionals, and these are paid internships, which we're happy to say. And if you follow our website and our newsletter, you'll see that these are advertised. But more importantly, perhaps, we have an annual conference. It's called the Nuremberg Forum. Professor Regenbogen spoke in this conference last year, as you know. And this year it will focus actually on the UN Charter and the Nuremberg Principles. And to a large degree, we are attempting to answer, even if imperfectly, the question that you just raised earlier as to how do we deal with the instruments we have and how do we try to make them more just and efficient. So if you'd like to follow that, either in person or online, I think that would be a good starting point to follow the work of the Nuremberg Academy. But I could just maybe conclude by saying, we are, of course, just a foundation here. The primary, if you're taking anything away from our work, it would be more if you'd like to actually read about the trial itself and learn its histories and its processes. I think this might be the bigger takeaway that we need right now, more understanding of how we got to where we were here in Nuremberg and how the city of Nuremberg, which you might know, was known as a byword really for atrocity. This is where the race laws happened, the rallies happened, how it transformed itself to some degree to a city of accountability. Of course, the Nuremberg itself did not do this. It was the organizers, but that history might be what you want to start following, and this also you can find through the literature on our website. But in general, please follow the website, and thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we could maybe take one more question if there is one, and then probably it's time to adjourn to the coffee area for any more discussion people want to have because there are classes. So yes, Professor Bertelsen.
Here. Well, thank you very much for the talk. So my question is if there's any space for the use of force against a government that is violating human rights and committing crimes against humanity with against their own citizens, and if the answer is no, as I expect, but what is the answer of international law today to those complex situations of just waiting and not do anything, or what can the international law actually tell us about those type of situations?
I think you have two questions for us to start. First is, who is the instigator of this rebellion or proportional use of force? And what do we mean by the force? So is this physical force, destruction, or is this a voice of democracy, getting on the streets peacefully? But again, you're dealing with what kind of country? If you're dealing with Iran, as an example, this is not just what we call a totalitarian state. This is in the 21st century. It's a total surveillance state, Orwellian nightmare. And it's the technology of the 21st century that suppresses them. And that's why before an uprising can begin, or any type of force, that kind of mechanism sets in. So what can you do? Well, you could say a country could go for nation building, and we know where that leads. Because we're not ready to do that because we don't have the ability and understanding of what the complexities are in other cultures. And that takes a profound understanding, which we don't have. So to really help civil society, as was mentioned here, that's where you begin. And when people in internet and civil society speak out in their countries, it vibrates around the world. And that also brings to state relationship.
Can I have a follow-up? Yes, like, sure.
Sure.
Okay, let's take Iran for a cycle, but what about Venezuela? Because Venezuela did everything they could. Like, I don't think we would be fair to civil society in Venezuela if we asked them to do something else. Like Venezuela, the civil society really tried everything possible.
Right.
So I don't have the answer, like, but what does international law say about, like, what do you do in a country like that? It's like
International
just keep
law,
waiting
right.
for.
Look, that you're right. I mean, international law is flawed in terms of giving people the opportunities and the legitimacy. It does say that under the United Declaration of Human Rights, they have legitimacy to have, freedom. And yet we have to remember that this is democracy we're talking about, a liberal world order. And many of these countries are not liberal in that context. So if you're going to take international law and premise it, what can we do according to international law? Well, it's not something that we can intervene in another country's evolution, because it's evolution, it's their norm, their tradition, their culture. And we have to understand that, because disrupting that kind of culture and norm and traditions brings about chaos. And that's the challenge that we all as humans face, the challenge of chaos. And we are struggling with our own conscience as how can we help these people get a better life? Well, we can only do it by supporting their agenda and doing it day in and day out, and ask our government to do it as well. And not just with words, but with measures in our trade, in whatever we do. And the more we do in that context, the better the chances that those civil societies will be successful. But it's a tough question, because the morality is saying, well, this is unjust, this is wrong. There's a lot, but let's be realistic. How do we help them without imposing our self-understanding of justice? Because it's them, not us, who are really being affected by what we do. And we need to be very careful about what we do in the name of justice.
Father, do you have any final thoughts for us today?
Thank you so much for that patience here. And it seems to me that for people like you, well, on people like you depend our future. Will you protect the law, the principles, the values, or will just give it for someone who wanna create new law according to their sometimes several visions? So I guess from people like you depends our future. So as a will press what you learn and just apply it properly for the sake of the humanity, for protecting people's right, people's dignity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Father. And Mr. Manon, I guess I'll give you the final word from the Nuremberg Academy today.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think I'll just add a simple line that I think international law has a history of over-promising and under-delivering to some degree. And therefore, I think when we look at its sort of legacies and possibilities, we shouldn't forget that it's just one part of what is a much more layered and intricate puzzle. And as Professor Regenbogen and the father said, if it's one thing to make an assessment that a crime has been violated and so on, but I think it's another thing for us to be vocal and pressure, whether it's our local representative or senator or whoever it is, to do the right thing and to isolate a nation or support a civil society. This is the sort of thing we saw in apartheid South Africa, for example, ultimately working out. and maybe we'll all be able to do that wherever we are in the world. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for coming today. And we're very happy if you'd like to join us for some coffee outside in the atrium and more discussion of these issues. So goodbye for now, everyone.